You may be seated. As you all know by now, today is Transfiguration Sunday, and it represents a turning point in the Gospel of Mark, and it represents a turning point in the life of Jesus and his public ministry. So for the first 8 chapters, roughly the middle of the Gospel of Mark, Jesus has been about the business of teaching, preaching, and feeding and healing. And today is something very different. Today is the day when Jesus turns his face toward Jerusalem and toward the cross. But before we go down into this valley of the Lenten journey, we get this one last brilliant flash of light. It's as if Epiphany flames out before we begin Lent. And we have this moment of resplendent wonder, of glory. And things like that don't happen very often. Or maybe they do, and we're not awake enough to see it. For most of the 1990s, my husband Eric and I lived in Hong Kong, and every so often we would take a long international flight from one side of the world to the other. And I don't remember exactly why, but in the instance I'm going to talk about, I was flying by myself. And these flights often take place at night, and often they go up and over the Arctic, because it's actually shorter to fly over the top than around the middle. So there I was, unable to sleep, and staring out of my window into the darkness. And I saw this little glimmer of light, but I knew we were way out of over the Arctic, so I didn't know what that was. And then the light began to flash, and the light began to grow, and suddenly there were these waves of light, and blues and greens and white light was dancing all around us as the aurora borealis just put on a light show for me personally. And I was thrilled. I'd never seen that. And I poked my head up above the seats and I looked out. Can anyone else see this? No, everyone's asleep. And I went back to the window and saw more of the light show and looked back over the people. I thought, aren't there any flight attendants or someone who can just be thrilled with me at this display? And everyone was still asleep. I wanted to shake someone awake and say, look, look, look how beautiful it is. But as far as I could tell, I was the only one. And then the light died down, and boop, it went away, just as suddenly as it started. But I never forgot what it was like to fly through a sky of dancing lights. So no wonder, transition. Changed it this morning. Our lives are like this. These rhythms of chaos and coherence. Things come together, things fall apart. In the seemingly random forces of chance and choice and change, we want to avoid things that are painful or scary or dark. And of course, we're drawn to the times of beauty and wonder and delight. We want to hang on to those things. We want to, in some sense, predict and control our lives because it makes us feel safe. But most of us have lived long enough to know that we don't actually get to predict or control. In fact, the only thing that we can predict is that things will change. So perhaps this is why our friend Peter this morning, in our gospel lesson for this morning, wanted to hang on to that moment. He wanted to stay there where things were beautiful and wondrous in the light of Jesus' revealed glory. The text says that there were three figures up there: Elijah and Moses and Jesus with his dazzling clothes and his shining face. So Peter says, this is fantastic. Let's make some dwellings. Let's stay here a while. And then the next verse says, but Peter didn't know what he was saying, for they were terrified. So that's Peter for you. When you don't know what to say, start talking. I might do that sometimes. And who could really blame Peter for wanting to stay there when it seemed that his dream of the powerful Messiah was finally coming true? In that moment of wonder and glory, it's like he could forget what Jesus said in the chapter previous to this. In chapter 8, Jesus gathers his disciples and he said, who do people say that I am? So they put out a few guesses. They said, well, some say that you're probably John the Baptist come back from the dead. And someone else said, oh, maybe you're Elijah, the great prophet. Jesus puts a finer point on it and says, who do you say that I am? And then Peter nails it. He says, you're the Messiah. But once again, Peter didn't really know what he was saying. Because, of course, the Jewish people for the longest time had been waiting for the Messiah who would be a warrior king. And this Messiah would come in and clean house and kick out the Romans and restore the temple to its former glory. But Jesus in the next breath turns to his disciples and says, I am going to suffer. I am going to die. And I will be raised on the third day. So, the disciples didn't sign up for that. Jesus was going way off script. And of course, they didn't understand any more than we do what it means for suffering and dying and how that invites us into a moment of transformation, or the implications that might have for us all. I want to dwell for a moment on this word transfigure, transformation. In the Greek, the word is metamorphete. So the question I had when I first read this text was, did Jesus really morph from one being into another? Was he, Jesus the man, talking with the disciples, and then suddenly God? Well, the answer is yes, he was, both. And in that moment, did Jesus really change, or was it that the veil was drawn back and suddenly they could see him for who he really is? It wasn't Jesus who changed. I believe it was the disciples who needed the transformation. Jesus didn't have to change. It is them and it is us who are invited into this time. Well, actually, life happens. Change will come. The question is, are we going to change in such a way that life comes out of this pain? That transformation produces growth and healing? But you see, it's very hard. It's hard for our old dreams to die, for our expectations to be dashed. And that's why Peter said to Jesus, after he said, I'm going to die, he said, no way. This can't happen to you. This is not how the story goes. And Jesus had to rebuke him and say, get behind me, Satan. Get behind me. you are setting your mind on the things not of God, but on the things of humankind. Transformation is hard. Dying to the old and rising to the new is a letting go. It's painful. And we wonder at those times, are these death throes or birth pangs? This changing that we see in our lives as we age, in our world as things happen and continue to happen. Are these death throes or birth pangs? The answer is yes. On either end of Lent, which we begin on Wednesday, we have two mountains. And on today's mountain, we have Jesus lit up with resplendent glory. But we don't get to stay there. This is the Jesus we want, but it's not the Jesus that we get. Because Jesus' story, and indeed our own stories, lead us to different places. Jesus turns his face toward Jerusalem and the cross, and there Jesus will be lifted up on another mountain. But this time he's going to be crushed, and he's going to be crucified. So, it's not the Jesus we wanted, but it's the Jesus we get. This is the Jesus who meets us in our times of suffering, and who takes us by the hand to lead us out of darkness into light, out of death and into life. But I have a question for you, and I'm going to end with this, almost end. What is the key ingredient that turns our suffering, our confusion, our times of chance and choice and change into transformation? Is that inevitable? Does pain always equal gain? How is it that death becomes life? In the arc of our story for today, and indeed all the scriptures, we are invited to step into a mystery. The mystery of the metamorphosis does not happen easily or quickly or automatically. And in fact, it's not really an arc at all, now that I think of it. It's more like a nadir. As the old things pass away and the new things come, I believe there is one crucial ingredient that invites our times of pain to become times of healing and wonder and transformation. And that is leaning in and listening to that voice. That is the mystery. That is the cloud of unknowing. That's what we hear at the end of our gospel story on the Mount of Transfiguration, where the voice says, not only to Jesus in the baptism, but to all of us this time, "This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him." That is what we are invited to hear this morning. We are the beloved ones. And in our times of confusion or pain, God is inviting us to lean in and let go and listen to this voice of love that changes us forever. Amen.